They handed me the papers at 6:47 in the evening. I know the exact time because I had just glanced at the watch my company gave me that morning, a heavy gold piece engraved with the words 40 years of excellence. I was still wearing it when my wife of 38 years walked across the banquet room, heels clicking like a metronome counting down my last seconds of ignorance, and pressed an envelope against my chest hard enough that I took a half step backward. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms do when something wrong is happening in public, not silent, but muffled, like the air itself was holding its breath. I opened the envelope. I read the words petition for dissolution of marriage printed in bold across the top of the first page, and I did something that surprised everyone in that room, including myself. I smiled. Not because I was happy. Not because I had seen it coming. I smiled because, in that precise moment, I understood with absolute clarity that my wife, and the two children sitting at the front table already rising to their feet to applaud her, had just made the single most catastrophic financial miscalculation of their lives. They thought they were ending mine. They had no idea they were beginning theirs. My name is Raymond Collier. I am 61 years old. For 34 of those years, I ran the internal operations of a regional freight company called Meridian Logistics. I started as a route coordinator, loading manifests by hand onto clipboards in a freezing dispatch bay. I ended as the company's majority owner, a fact I had spent 15 years carefully concealing from the woman who shared my bed and the two children I had put through university. People ask why I hid it. The AND funds, restructuring accounts, making the math work so that she never had to register the number in a bank statement. Our son, Callum, was 34. He operated what he called a boutique investment consultancy, a 3-person office above a dry cleaner downtown that had, to my knowledge, never turned a profit. For 6 years, I had quietly backed that office. Not in his name. Through a corporate entity he did not know existed, because Callum had a talent for burning money that bordered on artistic genius, and I did not want him to know the floor beneath him was something I had built. Our daughter, Sasha, was 31. She was the beautiful, ruthless social media version of her mother, curated, aspirational, completely hollow. She had a lifestyle that required funding at a level her content creation income could not justify, and so I had quietly been the invisible architecture beneath that lifestyle too. She did not know. She assumed she was simply talented enough to afford it. For 15 years, I had been the silent financial foundation beneath 4 lives, including my own. And SWR requires you to understand my wife, Diane. Diane was not a cruel woman in the cinematic sense. She did not scream or throw objects. Her weapon was far more sophisticated, a slow, persistent erosion of a person's value. She was the kind of woman who could look at a man who had just worked a 12-hour day and ask, in a voice of genuine puzzlement, why he seemed so tired. She collected expensive friendships the way other people collect art. She hosted dinner parties not for the pleasure of company but for the pleasure of being seen hosting. She spent money with a casual, unconscious velocity that I had spent 3 decades absorbing in silence, diverting on the evening of my retirement party, in a mid-range banquet hall Diane had booked. Specifically because she had chosen to spend the money she saved on the venue elsewhere, I finally understood that my entire family had gathered not to celebrate what I had built. They had gathered to divide it. What happened after Diane handed me the envelope will define, for the rest of my life, what it means to be underestimated. She took the microphone from the DJ stand at the side of the room. She tapped it once. She looked at the 62 colleagues and neighbors who had come to honor 4 decades of my professional life, and she spoke clearly, without trembling, with the rehearsed certainty of a woman who had been practicing this speech for months. She said she was done. She said she had spent the best years of her life standing in the shadow of a man who confused frugality with virtue and silence with wisdom. She said tonight was not my milestone. Tonight was her declaration. She used the word liberation twice. When she finished, my son stood up from the front table. He started clapping, slowly at first, then building, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a man who believes he has finally won something. Sasha rose beside him. She raised her glass. They had choreographed this. I understood that immediately. This was not a spontaneous act of solidarity with their mother. This was theater. This was a performance they had rehearsed in a living room somewhere while I was working. The room did not know what to do. I watched my colleagues, good people, many of whom had known me for 20 years, look at their plates, at each other, at the exits. I looked at Diane. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed my pen. I walked to the nearest table, moved aside a centerpiece of white carnations that Diane had chosen because they were the cheapest option available, and I signed every page of the divorce petition with calm, clean strokes. I handed the signed documents back to her without a word. Then I walked to where Callum was standing. I reached into my pocket. I placed his car keys to a vehicle leased under my corporate account, on the table in front of him. I did the same for Sasha, whose apartment lease I had been co-signing for 3 years. I picked up my gold retirement watch from the table where it had been sitting in its velvet box. I slipped it onto my wrist. I walked out of the banquet hall. I did not look back. I drove to a serviceable hotel near the interstate and checked in under my own name. I ordered room service, a club sandwich and black coffee, and I sat at the desk by the window and opened my laptop. I had roughly 48 hours before Diane's attorney attempted to freeze our joint accounts. I spent those 48 hours making certain there was nothing left in them to freeze. This is the part of the story that requires some explanation. 11 years ago, I was approached by the original founders of Meridian Logistics, who were facing bankruptcy and needed a silent buyer. I purchased a controlling stake using funds I had been accumulating in a corporate trust for nearly a decade, a trust structured in a way that my personal name appeared nowhere on the surface documentation. Diane knew I had a senior role at the company. She did not know I owned it. She did not know because she had never once, in 38 years of marriage, asked me a question about my work that was not followed immediately by a question about money. The marital accounts she planned to freeze contained exactly what I needed them to contain, enough to look like the savings of a mid-level executive, enough to satisfy her assumption that she knew what she was dealing with. She did not know what she was dealing with. By Thursday morning, her attorney had successfully executed a freeze on those joint accounts. I received a notification from my corporate attorney at 9:14 a.m. I was eating breakfast at a diner 2 blocks from the hotel, reading a paperback novel. I finished my coffee. I left a generous tip. I walked back to my room and called Warren Ng, the attorney who had been managing my corporate interests for 8 years. They moved, I said. I know, Warren said. You want to begin? Yes, I said. Start with the apartment. Sasha had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the most desirable part of the city for 3 years. The lease was in her name. The co-senior, which her landlord required given her income, was a holding company called Trellis Management Group. Trellis Management Group was mine. When Trellis withdrew its co-signature, the lease became non-compliant under the terms of the rental agreement. The landlord, a property management company with no personal interest in my daughter's situation, sent a formal notice of lease non-compliance within 72 hours. Sasha called me on Friday afternoon. I let it ring. She texted. The message read, "Dad, something happened with my apartment. Can you call me?" I put my phone face down on the hotel desk and returned to my book. Callum's situation required more precision, because Callum had a habit of moving money around in ways that were just barely legal, and I had spent 6 years quietly ensuring that the corporate entity backing his consultancy contained the right financial architecture to allow me to withdraw support cleanly, completely, and without leaving him any legal recourse. The letter that arrived at his office that Monday was simple. Trellis Capital, a separate holding entity from the one supporting Sasha, though both were mine, was dissolving its silent partnership agreement with his firm, effective immediately, per Clause 14(b) of the original investment agreement he had signed without reading 6 years ago. Clause 14(b) permitted immediate dissolution in the event of material misrepresentation of business performance metrics to the silent partner. Callum had been sending me quarterly reports sent unknowingly to my holding company, that bore absolutely no resemblance to his actual financial records. I had been comparing them to the real numbers for 4 years. The gap between what he reported and what actually existed was, by any legal definition, fraud. I did not call the authorities. I did not need to. I simply withdrew. Within a week, the consultancy had no operating capital, 2 employees it could not pay, and a 3-year lease on office space it could no longer afford. Callum burned through his personal savings in 11 days attempting to keep the lights on. By the 3rd week, he was calling his mother in a panic, which is how I know the conversation happened, because Diane's attorney, in the middle of their discovery process, accidentally included a transcription of a recorded phone call between Diane and Callum in a document package sent to Warren's office. In the call, Callum said, "Mom, something is very wrong. Dad did something. He got out before we could stop him." Diane said, "Don't worry. We're going to get everything in the divorce." Callum said, "How? What does he even have?" There was a long pause. Diane said, "I don't know exactly. But he's a mid-level logistics manager." "How much can it be?" If this story is hitting close to home, if you have ever given everything to people who looked right at your sacrifice and called it their entitlement, you are not alone. Subscribe to the Betrayal Files. New stories every week, for people who know exactly how this feels. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a downtown conference room that smelled of leather and institutional coffee. Diane arrived wearing ivory. She had hired Richard Paley, a divorce attorney whose reputation for aggression was the reason he charged what he charged. Paley had a stack of folders in front of him before anyone sat down. He had a legal pad. He had a gold pen. He had the confident posture of a man who had never once encountered a case that surprised him. Warren arrived with a single folder. One folder. Cream-colored. Thin. Paley noticed. He smiled at it the way a man smiles at something he thinks is beneath him. The deposition opened with Paley outlining Diane's demands. They were significant. Half the marital assets. Lifetime spousal support calibrated to the standard of living she had allegedly been entitled to. A cash settlement for emotional damages. A percentage of my executive pension. He used the phrase, executive pension, with particular confidence. Warren waited until he was finished. Then Warren opened his single cream-colored folder and placed one page on the table. Paley picked it up. I watched the shift happen, the slight stiffening in his shoulders, the second reading of the same line, the moment his pen stopped moving against his legal pad. Diane noticed. "What is it?" she asked. Her voice had acquired a new edge. Paley did not answer her immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about what he was reading. What he was reading was a postnuptial agreement. 9 years ago, during a period when Diane had been deeply concerned about a lawsuit against one of her friends, a lawsuit that had, she worried, the potential to expose the financial assets of people adjacent to the case, she had asked me to structure our assets in a way that protected her personal holdings from any legal liability connected to my business activities. I had done this. I had also, in the same document, included a morality clause, a clause that established that in the event of any financial misconduct by either party, including the concealment of debt, the unauthorized encumbrance of shared property, or deliberate misrepresentation of finances to the other spouse, the offending party forfeited all claim to the other's private assets. She had signed it without reading past the first page. Her signature was in blue ink. Her handwriting sloped slightly to the left, the way it always had. Paley set the page down carefully, as though it might be fragile. He turned to Diane. He said something quietly. I could not hear the words, but I could see her face change, the color leaving it in stages, like a tide going out. She turned to me. "This isn't real," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "You tricked me." "You signed it," I said. "Your attorney at the time had the opportunity to review it." "I didn't have an attorney. I strongly suggested you retain one." She stared at me. "You took out a second mortgage on our home," I said, keeping my voice level. "I have the documentation. You forged my consent using digital tools. The money was used to fund things I was not aware of. That conduct triggered the forfeiture clause." "That's not." "It is," Warren said, not unkindly. "And it's documented." Paley clicked his pen closed. He gathered his folders slowly, the way a man gathers things when he is computing whether a case is worth his time. He informed Diane, in the measured language of a professional who has delivered bad news before, that the agreement appeared legally sound, that he would need to review it further, but that he was not in a position at this stage to proceed with the claims as originally outlined. He would be in touch. He stood up and left the room. Diane sat alone on her side of the table. She did not cry. That surprised me. After 38 years, I would have expected tears. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something close to genuine bewilderment, as though she were trying to reconcile two images of the same person and could not make them fit together. "Who are you?" she said. I am the man who spent 34 years building something real, I said. You were just never interested enough to look. Sasha had moved in with a friend by the time her landlord formalized the lease cancellation. She called me 11 times in 8 days. I did not answer. On the 12th call, I picked up. She opened with anger, which is always where Sasha opens. The apartment. The co-signature. The fact that I had pulled the rug out without warning. I let her finish. Then I said, Sasha, I want you to think back to 6 days ago. You were standing at a table in a banquet hall. You raised a glass of champagne. Do you remember what you were celebrating? She didn't answer. I do, I said. I was there. I ended the call. Callum came to my hotel. He did not call ahead. He appeared at the front desk and asked them to ring my room, and they did, and I told them to send him up because I wanted to have this conversation in person. He sat in the chair across from the desk. He looked thinner than the last time I had seen him. He had dark circles beneath his eyes. He smelled of the particular kind of stress that does not wash off. He did not apologize, which I respected. Callum had always been honest in his dishonesty. He was calculating rather than theatrical, which made him easier to read than his mother. The consultancy is finished, he said. Yes. You own the fund backing it. Yes. He absorbed this. How long? 6 years. He looked at the window. The city was bright and gray and ordinary outside it. Why didn't you just tell me? Because you would have spent it faster, I said. And because I was trying to give you the dignity of believing you had built something yourself. He flinched at that. Good. I clapped for her, he said. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. Yes. You did. I didn't know about the mortgage. The forgery. I didn't know any of that. I believe you, I said. But you knew enough. You knew she was planning something. You knew she had been planning it for months. And you chose her side before you knew all the facts. He was quiet for a long time. What happens now, he said. Now, I said, you figure out what kind of man you want to be. Without my money as the floor beneath you. He left without another word. I did not hear from him for 4 months. The house went to the bank. This happened faster than even I had anticipated. When Warren submitted documentation of the forged digital consent to the mortgage lender, combined with the forensic financial records I had compiled, the bank moved with the kind of efficiency that financial institutions display when they believe they are the victims of fraud, which, in this case, they were. Diane received the foreclosure notice on a Sunday morning. I know this because the process server my attorney engaged sent a confirmation of delivery with a timestamp. I was sitting on the small balcony of my hotel room at the time, drinking coffee and reading about migratory birds in a nature magazine I had found in the lobby. I read the notification, set my phone down, and returned to the article. The birding article was more interesting. There is a particular quality to silence that only becomes available to you when you have removed the sources of noise from your life. I did not understand this until I was living it. In the months that followed, I finalized the purchase of a property I had been quietly considering for 2 years, a timber-framed house on a lake in the north of the state, surrounded by 40 acres of mixed forest and the kind of stillness that is not empty but full. Full of birdsong. Full of the sound of water moving over stones. Full of wind in spruce trees. I brought very little with me. The logistics company continued to operate under Warren's oversight. I had not abandoned it, I had simply stepped back from its daily rhythms to let the people I had spent 20 years hiring and developing run it the way I had always believed they could. I received quarterly reports. The numbers were good. I gave a significant portion of those earnings to a residential program for young adults aging out of the foster care system, a cause I had contributed to anonymously for a decade, one that Diane had referred to, on the one occasion I mentioned it, as a nice idea for someone with extra time on their hands. The house the bank had seized, our family home, the one Diane had mortgaged to fund her parallel life, I did not try to reclaim it. Instead, I worked with a charitable housing organization to convert it into transitional accommodation. The formal dining room where Diane had hosted her Friday night dinners became a study room. The walk-in closet that had housed $40,000 in designer items purchased with debt I did not know existed became a storage space for donated winter coats. I heard about this from Warren. He sent me a photo someone had posted online, the house freshly painted, modest garden, a small sign near the front door. I looked at the photo for a long time. Diane wrote to me once, 4 months after the deposition. Not a legal letter. A handwritten note, sent to Warren's office, forwarded to me at the lake house. The handwriting was less controlled than I remembered, and it sloped in a way that looked effortful, like the pen was heavier than usual. She did not ask for money. She said she had not fully understood what she had done. She said she had been living inside a version of our life that she had constructed for herself and that the version was very different from the real one. She said she knew this was not an excuse. She was right. It was not an excuse. I did not write back. Not because I was punishing her. But because I had spent 38 years responding to her, absorbing, adjusting, redirecting, and for the first time in my adult life, I was not required to respond. That freedom was quieter than I expected. And much larger. I did not take a single action in those months out of hatred. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. I did not stay awake imagining Callum struggling with his lease payments or Sasha navigating a less comfortable life. I did not feel satisfaction at the image of Diane in a smaller apartment, managing her own accounts for the first time at 60 years old. What I felt was something simpler and stranger. I felt accurate. For decades, I had lived inside a distorted picture, a picture in which my value was measured in what I provided, in which my silence was mistaken for contentment, in which the size of my love was inversely proportional to how visible I was allowed to be. The retirement party was meant to be my last act of invisibility. A final dismissal. A public stripping of the one remaining social dignity I had, the role of the man who had worked for 40 years and earned a moment of acknowledgement. Instead, it became the first moment of my life in which I was completely, ruthlessly clear. Not angry. Not vengeful. Clear. The loon is calling again tonight. It is a sound I did not know I was missing until I moved somewhere I could hear it. There is something in that call, wild and private and wholly indifferent to human drama, that I find clarifying. I am sitting on the deck with coffee and the last light of the day burning orange and amber on the surface of the lake. The trees are losing their leaves. The water is flat and mirror still. The world out here is completely indifferent to the retirement party, to the divorce petition, to the decades of calculated silence and the months of precise consequence. The world out here simply continues. I have been thinking about something Callum said when he visited me at the hotel. He said, "I didn't know." It's true that he didn't know all of it. But he knew enough. He knew his mother had been planning something. He knew that choosing that moment to stand up and applaud meant choosing a side before the evidence was in. What none of them knew, what I suspect they will spend a long time understanding, is that loyalty is not a performance. It is a practice. It is the small daily choice, made over and over, to stay honest with the people who trust you. They mistook my stability for gullibility. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my patience for a guarantee. They were wrong on all 3 counts. The fire is going inside the house. I can see it through the glass door behind me, the flames bending slowly in the draft. I made this fire with wood I cut myself this week, not because I had to, but because I wanted to know I could. That is perhaps the truest thing about this chapter of my life. I am learning, for the first time, what I am actually capable of when no one else's version of me is in the room. The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. Would you have done what I did, removed the safety net quietly and let the consequences arrive on their own schedule? Or would you have confronted them the night it happened, in that room, with all 62 of those witnesses watching? Tell me below. I read every comment. Backhand index pointing down.